New York City, 1924. The cacophony of automobiles, street vendors, and construction never reached Eleanor Miller's ears. At 23, she had spent 15 years in silence after scarlet fever stole her hearing as a child. The daughter of Irish immigrants who'd arrived with little more than hope and calloused hands, Eleanor navigated a world of vibration and visual cues, reading lips with remarkable precision. The Lower East Side tenement she called home trembled with the morning bustle as she pinned her dark hair beneath a modest cap. Her small room, separated from her parents by a thin curtain, contained few possessions: a worn dress for Sundays, a hairbrush with several missing bristles, and a faded photograph of her family before the silence came. "Late again, Eleanor," Mrs. Weiss, the factory floor supervisor, mouthed dramatically when Eleanor arrived at the garment factory. She could read the woman's disappointment in the tight lines around her mouth, the exaggerated movements meant to penetrate Eleanor's silence. Eleanor nodded apologetically and took her place at the sewing machine. The metal beast vibrated beneath her fingers, a familiar sensation, almost comforting in its predictability. Unlike people, machines never mumbled or turned away mid-sentence. Across town, Julian Harrington III stared out the window of his father's Rolls-Royce as it glided through Fifth Avenue. The 26-year-old heir to Harrington Industries adjusted his perfectly tailored suit, a costume that felt increasingly like a prison uniform. "The merger with Stanford Steel is non-negotiable," his father declared from the opposite seat. "Your grandfather built this company from nothing. I expanded it across 3 states. Your responsibility is clear." Julian nodded, having mastered the art of appearing attentive while his mind wandered. Last night, he had slipped away to a basement club in Harlem where a trumpet player from New Orleans had made his instrument wail like a human voice, raw and honest. That authenticity seemed worlds away from the boardroom awaiting him. "We're hosting a gala next Friday," his father continued. "The governor will attend. Your mother has invited the Ashford girl. Lovely family, excellent connections." "Of course," Julian replied automatically. Later that evening, as twilight settled over the city, Eleanor walked home with her shoulders hunched against the April chill. Passing a music shop, she paused. In the window, a gleaming gramophone stood on display. A small crowd had gathered, watching the shopkeeper demonstrate the device. Eleanor couldn't hear the music, but she watched the faces of the listeners, the way their expressions softened, how some closed their eyes or swayed slightly. Music was the great mystery of her life, a language everyone else seemed to understand instinctively. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the faint vibration of sound traveling through the barrier. Something stirred in her chest, a sensation she couldn't name, a pressure building like steam in a kettle. That night in her narrow bed, with the weight of tomorrow's work already pressing down, Eleanor hummed. She couldn't hear herself, but she could feel the vibration in her throat, her chest, her skull. It was a melody her mother had sung years ago before the fever, a lullaby about fields of green and skies of endless blue. Across the city, in his palatial bedroom, Julian loosened his tie and pulled a small notebook from his desk drawer. Inside were scribblings of lyrics, observations of the authentic America he glimpsed in those clandestine clubs. The America his father pretended didn't exist. "Preparations for the gala are underway, sir," his valet informed him. "Your mother has hired additional kitchen staff and servers for the evening." Julian nodded absently, unaware that among those temporary servers would be a young deaf woman with a voice she'd never heard, a voice that would soon shatter the carefully constructed walls of his world. The Harrington mansion blazed with electric light on the night of the gala, a beacon of wealth against the darkening Manhattan skyline. Inside, staff scurried like ants, polishing silver, arranging flowers, and transforming the already opulent home into a temple of excess. Eleanor stood in the bustling kitchen, overwhelmed by the flurry of activity. Her friend Rose, a regular kitchen maid at the mansion, had secured her this one-night position when another server fell ill. The extra money would help with her father's medicine. Just follow my lead, Rose mouthed carefully, ensuring Eleonora could read her lips. Serve from the left, clear from the right, and whatever you do, don't make eye contact with the guests. Upstairs, Julian adjusted his bow tie in the mirror, rehearsing the appropriate small talk for the evening. Market forecasts, golf handicaps, and non-committal comments about prohibition. The practiced smile felt tight on his face. Julian, darling. His mother appeared in the doorway, resplendent in emeralds and silk. Catherine Ashford is asking for you. Such a charming girl, and her father's railroad interests would align perfectly with our steel production. The ballroom hummed with New York's elite. Bankers, industrialists, politicians, all trading influence like currency. A small orchestra played Gershwin, the music floating above conversations about stock portfolios and summer homes. Eleonora moved through the crowd with a silver tray of champagne flutes, the liquid inside technically grape juice in deference to prohibition. She kept her eyes lowered, watching feet and hems to navigate the room. The vibrations of the orchestra traveled up through the floor, into her shoes, a faint tremor she could sense but not comprehend. Julian escaped his mother's matchmaking attempts and retreated to a balcony overlooking the garden. He loosened his collar, breathing in the cool night air. "Excuse me," a voice startled him. A server, the young woman with the champagne tray, had followed him outside, apparently thinking the balcony empty. Their eyes met briefly before she lowered hers, backing away with an apologetic gesture. Something about her struck Julian. The careful way she moved, like someone navigating by sight alone in an unfamiliar room. "No, please," he said, but she was already retreating. The evening progressed with excruciating predictability. Julian danced with Catherine Ashford, discussed business with the governor, and nodded at his father's boasts about Harrington Industries' latest acquisitions. By 11, he had exhausted his capacity for pretense. Slipping away from the crowd, Julian sought refuge in his father's library. He was surprised to find it already occupied. The same server from the balcony was dusting bookshelves, unaware of his entrance. "Hello," he said, but she continued working, her back to him. Julian approached and gently touched her shoulder. She startled violently, dropping her cloth, eyes wide with alarm. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back. "I didn't mean to frighten you." She watched his lips intently, then gestured to her ear and shook her head. Understanding dawned. "You can't hear me," Julian realized, speaking the words clearly. Eleonora nodded, relieved he understood. She pointed to herself and slowly mouthed, "Eleonora." "Julian," he replied, pointing to himself, then added unnecessarily, "This is my home." A crash from the hallway drew their attention. Voices approached, Julian's mother and several guests heading for the library. Panic flashed across Eleonora's face. Being caught alone with the son of the house would mean immediate dismissal. She looked frantically for an escape, finding only a door to a small anteroom. She slipped inside just as the library door opened. In the darkness of the anteroom, Eleonora pressed her back against the wall, heart hammering. Through a crack in the door, she watched Julian smoothly intercept his mother and her companions, redirecting them toward the conservatory to see a remarkable orchid that had just bloomed. When they departed, Julian returned and opened the anteroom door. Eleonora stepped out, trembling with relief and residual fear. "Thank you," she mouthed. Julian studied her face in the warm lamplight, her expressive eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she watched his lips. "How do you communicate?" he asked, enunciating clearly. Eleonora mimed writing. Julian led her to his father's desk, offering paper and a fountain pen. "I read lips," she wrote in a neat, deliberate hand. "And I write. I must return to work or lose my position." "Wait," Julian said, touching her wrist lightly. "What's it like?" "The silence?" Eleonora hesitated, then wrote, "Not silence. I remember sounds from before. Now I feel vibrations. I see expressions. The world speaks differently to me." Something in her words resonated with Julian's own sense of disconnection. "Would you meet me tomorrow? I'd like to talk more." Surprise flickered across her face, followed by suspicion. Men from his world didn't talk to women from hers without ulterior motives. "Why?" she wrote. Julian considered several diplomatic responses, then opted for honesty. "Because you're the most interesting person I've met tonight." The next afternoon, Julian waited at the Central Park bench they'd agreed upon. He'd dressed down in simpler clothes, though his idea of inconspicuous still involved fine wool and hand-stitched shoes. Eleonora arrived precisely at 2, wearing her Sunday dress, hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. She carried a small notebook. They walked through the park, Julian pointing out birds she couldn't hear, and Eleonora showing him details he'd overlooked. The pattern of sunlight through leaves, the subtle communications between strangers passing on paths. "I visit a jazz club in Harlem sometimes," Julian told her, making sure she could see his face. "The music there feels real, not like the orchestras at my parents' parties." Eleonora wrote, "What does jazz sound like?" Julian struggled to find words. "It's unpredictable, raw, like someone telling the truth when everyone else is lying." They continued meeting, in parks, at museums during quiet hours, once at a small Italian restaurant where the owner knew Julian from his clandestine visits to Little Italy. With each encounter, the barriers between them thinned. Julian found himself speaking more honestly than he ever had. Eleonora's notebook filled with observations, questions, and gradually confessions of her own fears and dreams. One evening, as autumn painted the city in amber and russet, Julian took her to the rooftop of an abandoned warehouse. The Manhattan skyline spread before them, a constellation of electric lights. "I want you to feel something," Julian said, producing a small portable phonograph he'd brought. He placed it on the ground and set the needle on a record, Louis Armstrong's West End Blues. "Put your hands here," he guided her fingers to the wooden cabinet. As the music played, vibrations traveled through the wood into her fingertips. Eleonora closed her eyes, her expression transforming as she absorbed the rhythm, the variations, the feeling of the music. Without thinking, she began to hum along, feeling the vibrations in her throat match those beneath her fingers. Julian froze, transfixed. Her humming grew stronger, more confident, until she was singing, wordlessly but with perfect pitch, her voice weaving around the melody she could only feel, not hear. When she opened her eyes and saw his expression, she stopped abruptly, embarrassed. "Eleonora," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he took hers. "Your voice, it's extraordinary." Word spread quickly through Manhattan's elite circles that Julian Harrington was consorting with a working-class girl. Worse, she was disabled, a deaf factory worker with no family connections, no education, no prospects. "This has gone far enough," Richard Harrington declared, slamming his fist on his desk. "I've indulged your eccentricities, Julian. Your midnight excursions to those colored jazz clubs, your artistic pretensions. But this girl is beneath you." "She has a name," Julian replied coldly. "Eleonora Miller. And she possesses more authenticity in one moment than I've witnessed in 26 years among our social circle." His mother wept dramatically. "Think of the family name, the business, your future. The Ashfords have practically announced your engagement to Catherine." "I never agreed to that match," Julian said. His father's voice dropped dangerously. "End this folly immediately, or I'll ensure your Miss Miller never works in this city again." Her parents too. The threat hung in the air between them, poisonous and real. Julian knew his father's influence extended into every factory, every respectable business in New York. That evening, Julian waited for Eleonora at their usual meeting place, a small bookshop that stayed open late. When she arrived, her smile faded as she read the tension in his face. "What's wrong?" she wrote. Julian explained his father's ultimatum. Eleonora's hand trembled as she wrote, "I understand. This ends now." No," Julian said fiercely. "I have a plan." He had spoken with a music producer who owed him a favor, a man who had built his record company from nothing and retained his appreciation for authentic talent. Julian had described Eleanora's voice, its pure, untrained quality, how it seemed to channel something essential and true. "He wants to hear you sing," Julian told her. Terror flashed across Eleanora's face. She scribbled frantically, "I can't perform. I can't hear myself. I don't know what I sound like." "I know what you sound like," Julian said, taking her hands. "You sound like America, the real America. Not the sanitized version in my parents' ballroom, but the one with struggle and hope and raw beauty." The following week, they met the producer in a small recording studio. Eleanora stood frozen before the microphone, panic evident in every line of her body. Julian placed the phonograph beside her, playing the Armstrong record she knew through touch. He guided her hand to feel the vibrations, then stepped back. For several agonizing moments, nothing happened. Then, hesitantly, Eleanora began to hum, her voice tentative at first, then gaining strength as she surrendered to the feeling of the music traveling through her fingertips. The producer's expression transformed from skepticism to wonder as her wordless melody filled the room, haunting, soulful, utterly unique. When she finished, the silence held a quality of reverence. "I've never heard anything like it," the producer said finally. "It's as if she's channeling something ancient and new simultaneously." 3 months later, Eleanora Miller's first record was released. The label marketed her as the sensing singer, the deaf woman whose voice captured the soul of jazz. The novelty drew initial attention, but it was the raw, emotional quality of her voice that created genuine demand. Julian's father was furious when his son resigned from Harrington Industries to become Eleanora's manager. His mother was scandalized when they moved into a modest apartment in a mixed neighborhood near the recording studio. Yet as winter gave way to spring, something shifted. Eleanora's record played in speakeasies and legitimate music halls alike. Critics wrote about the voice that bridges worlds, not knowing how literally true that was. When Julian brought Eleanora to his parents' home, 6 months after their ultimatum, her record sales had made headlines. Richard Harrington's business associates were now asking to meet the remarkable Miss Miller. "You've made your point," his father conceded grudgingly. "She's unusual, but your place is here, running the company." "My place is creating something authentic," Julian replied. "Something that will outlast steel and concrete." As they left the mansion, Eleanora took Julian's hand. On the street, a vendor was playing her record. A small crowd had gathered, listening. "They're playing your song," Julian said, making sure she could see his face. Eleanora smiled and placed her hand against the vendor's cart, feeling the vibrations of her own voice coming back to her. She couldn't hear the music, but she could feel its impact. In the expressions of the listeners, in the way a young couple began to dance, in the vendor's appreciative nod. In that moment, in a city built on ambition and divided by circumstance, Eleanora and Julian had created something that transcended both silence and sound, a bridge built of vibration and feeling, spanning the distance between their separate worlds.